Lance Young is the chief sachem or sachem of the Nemasket Nation, the Wolf Clan, which is headquartered and is the area around Lakeview and Taunton. There is a real issue in his genealogy because he is a direct descendant of the major sachems of the early colonial period, particularly including through Tepasquin and Sachem Amy, who was the daughter of Massasoit. Massasoit, I guess, is more of a title, and I don't know how to pronounce Sequim or what his name was, but I'm sorry to make that apology to Lance. But the issue of leadership descends through these families through 10, 12 generations at this point. Anyone who reads this history realizes that by 1800s, people believed that the Native American tribes of this area were, quote, extinct. That was never the case. There has always been an active group of persons who keeping the oral history alive. And that's Lance's duty and his gift through his grandparents, who were Princess Swiftwind or Bernice Walmsley, and from Great Moose, the late Russell Gardner, who was the renowned historian of the Wampanoags and who was the person who traced these lands through to today. Lance is also a graduate of Middlebury College and a technology expert. You can see from his background, this is his economic livelihood. Is director of marketing for technology company located in this area. He's also a graduate of the Center for Creative Leadership and a certified facilitator of the Strengthening Families Program for Native Americans. He lives in Medford. We are honored that he is a formal advisor for the partnership, and we couldn't ask for a better helper and a better person to be part of us. And Lance, take it away, and thank you so very much for every contribution you've made and you will in the future.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that, John. So let me get right to the presentation here, because as John said, we certainly do have a lot to cover here, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for everyone to ask any questions that they might have at the end of this, because I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. So the topics that I'd like to discuss tonight is I'd like to give you a brief overview of why I chose the two readings and then the complementary subsequent readings. Talk a little bit about pre-contact life, this concept in Indigenous communities about we are the land and how that personified itself in everyday actions in terms of what they did. And then talk about the arrival of the Puritans and the Pilgrims and others and how that affected the understanding of our land. And then I have a few final thoughts about where we are today and where we should be going. So the two readings that I chose, Anderson's King Phillips Herd and Springer's American Indians and the Law of Real Property in Colonial New England, show two basic ideas about what was happening at the time that the Puritans landed in the Boston area. So Springer's looking at the idea of how was the concept of English law and property rights applied to the natives. Is there a way that could have been applied? He also looks very much at how the Puritans and how the magistrates of the courts really tried to be fair, as much as fair as can be, with how deeds and court proceedings were within the context of how Indian property was evaluated and adjudicated. King Phillips Herd, on the other hand, is if Springer's talking about how does the law apply, the issues that Anderson brings up in King Phillips Herd is really about the actual conflict on the ground, especially as that related to things like livestock, animal husbandry, crops, and the placement of colonial villages next to English settlements and so forth, and how those two things ultimately, because of the livestock, brought together one of the most cataclysmic clashes that we could possibly know of, which was King Philip's War. So there's this irony that King Philip himself had a herd, but it was in fact livestock that precipitated going to war. Again, that wasn't the only thing, but that certainly was one of them. So I'd like to give a little bit of a pre-contact story of creation, and I'm going to give this to you so that you can juxtapose that to your understanding of the Puritan sense of religion. Many Native Americans tribes had and still have creation stories that explain how the land came to be and how all of the animals came to be on the land. Those narratives that you might have read give you a glance at how Native people lived and how they thought, and it illuminates how very different the thought system that Indigenous people had from the thought system of Europeans. Of course, Europeans had a creation story, but it was based on a very different sense of a God and one light and so forth and so on. Many Indigenous people in New England or in the Eastern Woodlands area had a creation story or legend about the fact that the land mass was on the back of a giant sea turtle, and that the land was created and put on that sea turtle, and actually North America is floating on this sea turtle. You may hear still today, many Native Americans call North America Turtle Island for that very reason. And in that creation story, there's a lot of conversation around the equality of all beings that are on the earth and the earth itself. There's no sense of superiority of human beings and so forth and so on. And even though there's a sense of humans being caretakers of the land, there is an equality of this idea of living in tandem with the natural world. So these legends were captured by the Europeans as early as the mid-1600s. And I emphasize that as a critical example of an irreconcilable thought system between the Puritan settlers and the natives. So let's talk a little bit about pre-contact Indigenous life and how they were. So in New England, the Eastern Woodland tribes were actually highly sophisticated, very far from what we're told or we read about of them being savages. These were Algonquin linguistic groups, which means that the root base of the languages that they spoke was based on Algonquin, but each tribe had a distinct language that they all spoke. And I tell you that because if you remember a slide or two ago, I talked about Springer's idea of applying English property law to Native Americans. And one of the biggest problems with that is that all of the proceedings were in English. Two problems that we see from that. One, all of these tribes, whether it was the Pecasset or the Punkapog or the Matakeesit or the Narragansets, had they didn't have the same language. So trying to fit that idea that you could apply this one language to all of these people was in and of itself a problem. These tribes were sophisticated and complex. They traded in corn, in coats, meats, fish products. Their knowledge of the forestry and their lands was astonishing to the Europeans. They were very adept at using the waterways and the inland rivers as highways. They formed networks stretching thousands and thousands of miles in which they traded with tribes and people as far away as what we know as Ohio and Florida, Nova Scotia, even extending down to the Caribbean and even to South America, where we know the corn product originated and then was brought up to the Eastern Woodland Indians where it planted that. And one extraordinary thing was that wampum became a critical commodity as a medium of exchange, or almost as a money, if you will. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what wampum was in a minute. But two very important things that I want you to hold. Native Americans had very little or no immunity to disease or viruses. They were extremely clean. And if you read some of the things that the English say, they talk about how they bathed constantly. They had sweat lodges and they were constantly bathing. So they were very, very clean. So when the Europeans came over and introduced pathogens to them, that was catastrophic in many ways to them. Relative to how it eliminated a lot of the populations. And then the other piece of this is that there were seasonal migrations. So these people would constantly migrate, and the migrations were because, say, for example, in the summertime, their summer home was by the water. They moved a little bit more inland because, as we all know, New England winters can be notorious, but they also did not want to deplete areas of the natural resources because they were always very careful about resource constraints. I love this quote by James Adair that says that they were all equal. There was never a sense that people had a hierarchy of belonging, but there was a sense of shared between them. So this idea of the tribes investing themselves in the land and this concept of we are the land and the land as a living witness comes from the idea that the land was fundamentally part of them, part of their being, part of their belonging. They didn't see the earth as a possession that you could purchase or sell. They treated the earth as a place and all of its being with the same sense of aliveness and self-conscious as they were. So this idea that the earth was a living entity and they were a part of that living entity, that they cared for it and they maintained it. And in return for that, the earth gave them harvest, wild game, medicine, water, health. And it was important to understand that you needed to keep the balance between what you did and how you were in the world and what the world gave back to us. So they believed that they were valuable to the maintenance of the earth, that they had to take care of the earth. Participation was vital by everybody, and the concept or the idea of a failure to interact with the land would break down the interactions and could lead to calamities and tragedies. So if you read the Springer thing, Springer states that it's unclear whether or not there was a tribal hierarchy. If you read any other pieces, and actually in the Anderson piece, you see that there's a divergence of ideas. But in fact, tribes had a very clear and defined sense of leaders. And these were hereditary sachems or squaw sachems, which were women who actually held positions of leadership. And they were the primary authority and had the most responsibility for the safety and the care and the well-being of the tribe. They negotiated with other tribal leaders. They oversaw the bounties of planting and hunting. They distributed land so that they could be planted. They had illicit duty to ensure the survival of the tribe, but that was based on their interactions with the tribe. So they basically represented the tribe. They listened to the tribe, they understand what the tribe needed, and then they acted to make sure that that happened. And they represented the tribe in all negotiations with other tribal places. So the idea that the land was not permanently occupied became a problem later for Indigenous people because there really were no fixed habitations because they were migrating seasonally and they certainly didn't have any fenced fields. And you'll see that this idea, which the Puritans brought over with them, vacum domicilium, which meant that the land was empty and so that it wasn't occupied or cared for, so that they had the right to take that land. So that was a process of misunderstanding. Why those lands may have been emptied or why they may not have been habitated is because they were moving seasonally and they had that concept of trying to keep the land from being depleted. So we talk about the treaties and the trades between Indigenous people, and a few minutes ago I talked to you about wampum. A few things to understand. Native Americans, at least in the eastern woodlands area, had no written language. Okay, they did not have a language. They didn't have paper. They didn't write things down. But sachems negotiated not with written words or with treaties, but they exchanged elaborately made wampum belts of different lengths. And these wampum belts, basically within them, with the way that they were coded or how long they were, decided the nature of what the treaty was and how the treaty was. And land treaties could be sharing of the land with another tribe, letting another land use certain fields to plant their crops. But it never meant that those sachems that allowed that sharing or went into those treaties quit their land altogether. So that's an important point to realize is too. There was no idea that, oh, we're giving this land to the Pecasset and we as the Nemasket no longer have rights to that land. They maintained and believed that they should maintain the right to use it and the right to get it back once those treaties were null and void. I want to quickly go over this part here because this is important too. So this idea of participation and this idea of balance between men and women, which was something that wasn't as present with the Puritans and with other people. So participation was balanced between men and women. Women had strong influence in tribal matters. As I said before, there were times when women were leaders. The leader of the Pocasset tribe at the time of King Phillips' War was a female, Weetamo. But the women managed certain things. They managed the planting and the harvesting. They managed things like gathering the grains and the herbs. They kept the fires. They managed the seasonal dwelling shifts and movements. Men, basically, there was a stronger sense of men being the hereditary leaders because there were more of them. But again, women had a strong influence in the ongoings of the tribe. But they protected the people in their lands. They defended the quarries, and they did a lot of the fishing and the whaling. And then they led the intertribal relations. The one thing that surprised, I think, most of the Europeans in terms of this relationship and how women were involved is that it's not as though the Europeans had never seen women in positions of power or leadership. Obviously, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Mary, Queen of Scots, to name a few, but those were few and far between, whereas in the tribal world, there were many, many women who had many, many jobs of importance in leadership and were important to the land. So it wasn't just the men doing the jobs, but it was the women. And sometimes those women were as powerful as the men in those tribes were. So the strangers in the land. I think, and I've written a blog about this that will soon be on the partnerships site about this idea of when and how the idea that the land in North America was up for taking really came from John Smith. So many of you may know John Smith, and hear me out on this one, who sailed down in 1614 from Maine's coast to the Shawmut Peninsula. Shawmut is what the English renamed Boston when they got here in 1630, but Shawmut was the indigenous name. Shawmut was managed by a Native American called Obitinawap. But the idea that the indigenous people had no claim on their land, in my opinion, could be traced back to John Smith. John Smith in 1614 drew a map of this area and he named it New England with complete. So the idea was, this is a means to further English imperial aims and also as a way of attracting colonists who could claim the land as their own as well. And like many of the 17th century people who came, I believe there was a disregard for the fact that there were people who were here and had certain inherent rights to this land. So in naming that New England, even before the Puritans got here in 1630, actually a little earlier than that, because we know that they were in Maine and also what is now southern New Hampshire. But when they got into Boston or Shawmut, there was always already a sense that this was called New England. But this wasn't the first time that we had experienced strangers in our land. Smith and the Pilgrims and the Puritans were kind of late to the party. So it's suspected that around the year 1000 AD, maybe a little earlier than that, Leif Erikson and others of his land had come to North America and had traded and even many times had wintered over with Native Americans. And from that point on, Miguel de Coterreal, whose name is inscribed on that rock right there that you see, which is Dighton Rock, stating that he had come here to live among the natives, right down through until we get to 1602 and then even further. The difference, though, that I would say between these people who came and who set up elaborate trading agreements with the natives never came to take their land, never came to stay on their land, never came to possess their land. So that is a fundamental difference, in my opinion, about what happened in 1618 in Virginia with the first colony that was established here. And then, of course, in 1620 with the Pilgrims, who came with no charter in hand, but came in and settled in what we know as Plymouth today. And then, of course, in 1630 with the arrival of the Puritans. So the setup for this came from the Royal Charter, and I don't know if you all know this, but there was Charles I in 1629 granted a royal charter to the Puritan leaders of the New England Company, and that charter incorporated them as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it specifically entailed the land that this colony would become. So there were certain places from, I believe, the exact bounds of the Merrimack River down to a part of what today we call the Charles River, but that land mass in there was now part of this Massachusetts Bay Colony, which Charles I granted the charter for them to do that, authorizing them to migrate to New England and set up the colony. So the initial idea of that colony was, the Puritans wanted to set up a godly community, which was based, if we push this back to what I said in the beginning about the creation story, a godly commonwealth, which was basically focused on the purity of the Bible and the purity of the Puritans' belief around religion. Again, I bring that back to the creation story about the myth of Turtle Island, how Indigenous people did not fit into that specific thing. And you all know that John Winthrop was the first governor of that colony. So a few things about the arrival, some critical points. They didn't arrive with all the provisions that they needed, and initially the Native Americans sustained them, allowing them to occupy cleared hunting parks, so giving them place to occupy, to set up shop, if you will. We engaged with them in trading fur and so forth, and never did we assume that the treaties that we were involved with them assumed that we would quit our land altogether, similar to the treaties that we had signed or we had made with the wampum belts with our own Indigenous people. So you have the understanding here. I think the thing that is critical is that you have a group of people who have come, who speak and are very different from the people who are already there, who have a sense of English law and the idea of property and what property is and how property is used. And you have Indigenous people who have a very different sense of not necessarily ownership or possession of property, but the fact that the property was part of them and that the land was part of them and that they were part of the land and that they were sharing in this. So to bring the English into their networks to collaborate with them, but the English had a very different sense of land and ownership of that land itself. So the whole concept of, and this is where Springer talks a great deal about how the decision was made because, one, natives did not have written language. They didn't have really any way of understanding how they could determine how they owned their land or how they owned any of the land, that transfers, deeds, claims, and so forth would be managed in the English court system, in the general court system, because the English had a process and a way that they could record these things in a way that Native Americans did not have those things. So here's the basic problem. The basic problem is, how do you determine which land belongs to whom in terms of Native Americans, and how do we sell that land? Springer sets up this idea that all of the chiefs of the tribes had the right to decide when they could sell land. So if you've ever looked at any of the deeds and Jeremy Banks' book, Indian Deeds, you'll notice that all of the deeds are signed or witnessed by Indigenous chiefs selling or giving land to the Puritans. And I think one of the things that the general court tried to do, and I think they tried to do really well, they tried to actually set up a fair and equitable way of dealing with land and how the land would be transferred from Indigenous people to the colonists. And they were successful. If you look at some of those initial treaties, there was a lot of fairness in terms of how things were dealt with. And as land got more and more privatized, those things became a little bit more difficult relative to how those transfers were done. One of the most interesting things is the question came to John Winthrop, which is here, and his question was asked to him is, what right do we have to take the land that has long time been possessed by other sons of Adam? And basically, you know, his answers came down to, this is a short clip of that statement, but, you know, his concept was that the savage people have ruled over many lands without title or property. Again, English idea of title and property had to be written, whereas Native people didn't have the ability to do that. It wasn't as though they didn't have dominion over those, they just couldn't prove them in the eyes of the English. That they don't enclose their grounds, neither do they have cattle to maintain it. So this concept of livestock is now introduced to the idea that you have to have some form of cattle or some type of livestock that you're maintaining on those grounds. That because we moved seasonally, that we don't have permanent dwellings, that we remove our dwellings as we have occasion to remove those, and that they believe that God gave men a twofold right to the earth. The first was the natural right, and then the second was a civil right. That natural right was when men held the earth in common, and every man then sowed and could feed where he pleased. But then the idea of men bringing cattle into it then allowed them to take possession of land, enclosing them and caring for those lands, and this gave them a civil right to the land. So this idea that the Indians couldn't prove, or the natives could not prove, that they, because they didn't have permanent dwellings and they did not enclose their land, that proved that the land was theirs, this was justification enough for the Christians to take that. And not only that, that there was plenty of land to go around. And then finally, that because of the plagues and the disease, that God hath consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby the greater part of the country is left void, and that we have the right to take that land. So this concept of the Puritans' private property was a shock to Native Americans. The sense of individual ownership was a shock to them because there was no such thing as individual ownership. I should clarify something. It's not as though the sachems didn't believe that, for example, that the area that they believed was their land, that the Nemasket chiefs understood their land to stretch from point A to point B, that they, as the hereditary sachems of those, that was their land to be stewards of and take care of for their tribes. They just didn't have that sense that you could take one individual and give them a piece of property and fence it off for only their use and only their good and not for the rest of the tribe. So that concept of fencing off of tribal lands and introducing animal husbandry into that created a schism that we'll see here in a minute, was something that was completely irreconcilable. And also the fencing off and the taking of land was pushing Native people further and further away from their villages, from the places that they had known, and actually displacing them in droves. So the idea of success. So Winthrop learned a lot from the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims didn't come with any cattle or swine or anything, and it was very difficult for them to try to establish themselves because, as you know, English people depended a great deal on animal husbandry, and the colonization of New England heavily depended on that. So not to make that mistake, Winthrop came with thousands and thousands of animals. They imported many, many cattle, swine, sheep, horses, and others into New England. And livestock was essential to their survival, but they didn't realize how objectionable it would become to the Native Americans. One of the problems with it is that because the natives didn't fence their fields in, livestock would roam into their fields and it would eat their corn and it would eat their crops and so forth and so on. And because the English villages were established right alongside of many of the native villages, you had this conflict of constantly no demarcation of English inhabitations and Indian villages. And there was always this concept of trespassing from livestock and the destruction of crops and native grasses, which made the situation more tense for the Native Americans. So animal husbandry, as I've said, was not a practice that Native Americans had. The only domesticated beings they had were dogs. So Native Americans had dogs, but there was no thought that of having any other animal. They never tried to domesticate anything else. The idea of animal husbandry challenged their spiritual beliefs. It challenged their sense of what belonged to the earth and how they belonged to each other, that their mental universe really didn't have a distinction between humans and other beings. So the idea of putting other beings into a fenced-in area and raising them for things like food without natural rights of hunting and ritual to go to seek after those things was very difficult to them. They didn't see these animals as inferior to the human people, to humans or to any other being. They saw them as the same. So the issue with animal husbandry was very difficult for Native Americans to understand. Killing required an intimate knowledge of creatures, and it based on heavy rituals and sacred fires and offerings when they went out to hunt their animals. They never wasted any of their animals. They used everything. And so as husbandry was not a practice, natives were never really comfortable with it, or with the fact that a lot of their land they were seeing now was being transformed by cattle and by sheep and by other non-human life beings that they felt was dishonorable in many ways. One of the key things that the Puritans tried to do, because there was such a growing problem, by the 1640s, many Native Americans were prohibited from their lands. They were fenced off. They were ousted from their lands. Eliot's translation of the Bible to actually he translated it to Natick was critical, because there was an idea that was brought up that the Puritans would try to bring in as many of the Native Americans as they could and convert them to Christianity and make them more and more like they were, as a way of helping to offset the fact that they were taking much of their land. The idea came into being of creating these things called praying villages. Because of the speed with which the Puritans had acquired private property and started to displace the Native Americans, they felt that they had to do something. There was actually an act, the 1646 Act of Propagation of the Bible amongst the Indians by the General Court of Massachusetts, to try to convert them. And I would say not in a forcible way that we saw later, as the country grew, but sort of in a way of, can we put them in places and try to convert them? We have this Bible in their language to bring them into being a part of our communities and so forth. Because there was such a growing number of them that no longer had their homelands, these praying villages were set up. But the problem with those praying villages is that the natives had to leave all of their traditions behind. They had to leave their customs behind, their dress behind. They had to act and be more like the Puritans were, which included this concept of livestock and animal husbandry. So for the most part, by about 1650, by the time we got to King Philip's War, between 1651 and 1675, about 40% of Indigenous people in the area, when I say the area, I'm talking about Massachusetts, had been relocated to these praying villages as a way of converting them and as a way of bringing them into the Puritan way of being. This divorced them from their sense of their connectedness to the land, the connectedness to their rituals and to their spirituality, and completely changed the concept of what it meant to be a Native American, often called now praying Indians at that point. As time went on, the livestock problem with crops and trespassing, not only did it not end, it got more and more difficult. There was just more and more problems, more and more disputes, more and more problems with livestock and crops being destroyed. The natives were constantly being forced to comply to English conditions with cattle fencing, so forth and so on. There were places where livestock could not be and should not be. Hence, if you read the Anderson paper, you'll see that this is why King Philip was prohibited from grazing his swine in Portsmouth, so that his herd could not graze there. And while the magistrates did the best to police complaints near and around the important cities and towns such as Boston, it wasn't true everywhere. So there was this overrunning of native fields and native crops, and enforcement of some of the rules and regulations that were put in place were not consistent, especially as you got further on the edges of the settlement. And this became a situation that over time became more and more intolerable. It wasn't as natives weren't treated as fairly as their English neighbors when they would go and complain about the fact that the English livestock or the English herds were trespassing on their land, that it was necessarily not adjudicated as the same way as the English problems were when they would complain about the Native Americans. So this became a constant problem. Both sides had threatened violence many times over this issue of livestock, over this issue of land. And it wasn't just livestock, but it was this issue now of the displacement of Native people from their land, the removal, the pushing out of them. And finally, things reached a tipping point. As you all may know, the Native Americans made good on their threat. So in 1671, the English made a threat against the Indigenous people. They kind of settled that down. But in 1675, the Native Americans did actually make good on this threat. Because of those mounting frustrations, the problem that had vexed the Native Americans, two problems that vexed the Native Americans and the English for years: this concept of land, this concept of being displaced from their land, and then this extraordinarily growing problem with livestock led to King Philip's War. And this war would be one of the bloodiest and costliest for both Native Americans and settlers. Metacom, King Philip, as you may know, was the son of the late Pokanoket chief sachem Osamekin, who was called Massasoit. He and his warriors were unrelenting in their quest to regain their territories. His intention was to expel the English forever, and the English mounted a formidable offense against King Philip. But at the beginning, at the onset, Metacom had the upper hand, and he was ruthless in his attacks across New England. The English were terrified by this. By the time the war was over, he had razed 25 colonial towns and burned them to the ground, burned their crops, destroyed their crops, but also focused on destroying their livestock. So, you know, there were hundreds of cows that were slaughtered, specifically cows that he slaughtered. He took no prisoner, which was so antithetical to Native Americans. They were not in the business of killing their prisoners, but they used them as ransom. But in this case, they did slaughter people. The English were as equally savage, killing men, women, and children. slaughtering whole native villages, trapping the Narragansett tribe and the Pokanoket in the Great Swamp in Kingston, Rhode Island, killing more than 300 people in less than a few days. And as you all know, King Philip's War ended in a crushing defeat of Metacom. In August of 1676, he was gunned down at Mount Hope. This was a catastrophic event for Indigenous people in New England. Not only had this war taken its toll on both sides, and some of the English villages, some of the Native American villages that were not praying towns were completely leveled. In the aftermath of that, my ancestors were hunted down, they were beaten, they were imprisoned and killed, they were run off their homelands. Bounties were offered for their scalps. Many of them were relegated to a few Indian reservations, and many more of them were sold into slavery. And this land, which was the expression of ourselves, became the spoils of war, and anyone could take the land at that point. So the outcome determined what I would say the outcome of King Philip's War determined the fate of the native people in New England, and ultimately the destiny of what we would call Turtle Island, which then became, of course, the United States of America. So a final thought, the land of my ancestors is still teeming with evidence of our existence. That picture in the beginning of the cave, that was King Philip's cave, that still carries the memory of our ancient existence. The seat at Mount Hope is still there. The petroglyphs and the rock carvings still hiding in plain sight show the proof that we were here. The sweetgrass, the fishing weirs that are partially submerged but still visible in all parts of New England. We're in the process of the springtime herring run, which welcomes thousands of migratory herrings that thrash and struggle, fight to make their way upstream from Mount Hope Bay, are still there. The quahogs, which are still harvested and made into great wampum belts and other things, as we did 400 years ago. Deerskin, we're still doing those things that were dried and then made into regalia. We still practice our ceremonies, such as the Green Corn Festival. We still practice weddings in traditional ways, powwows and other things. And of course, I am a living witness, and many other, that we actually didn't disappear from the land, that we are still here, that we still understand those ties to the land, and that we are reemerging again in a way that people are starting to listen and say, what do we do here? How do we help figure out a way that we can work together that is mutually beneficial to all of us, which was something that 400 years ago, our ancestors couldn't do. And hopefully we find a way to do that today. And some of the stuff that the Partnership of Historic Bostons is actively involved in, and certainly I thank them for that. On a final note, before I open it up, I'd like to say that, if you want to learn more, you can join the partnership. The email to contact there. The website is there. You can join the Facebook page or follow them on Twitter. There are two upcoming events, the 14th of April, the Rule to Walk By, which Roxanne Reddington-Wild is going to speak on. And then on the 19th of May, Sarah Stewart and Frances Bremer will talk about a 17th century life. And there's a number of additional readings that I have posted here that can tell you more and talk a little bit more in depth about this subject and this topic, which is so deep, and there's so much there that in 45 minutes or so, we can just begin to scratch the surface of understanding that. But I hope that gave you a little bit a better understanding of how what the Native people thought, how they lived, how they understood the land, and then that conflict that happened that ultimately ended in the way that it ended. And I think with that, I'll thank you, and I'll bring it back out to John and to James to see if we have questions, or if anyone has comments, or if there are things you want to talk a little bit more about.
Thank you, Lance.
Sure. Let me stop my share here.
Thank you so very much, Lance. That was a fine and a remarkable presentation. Lance is also working on a written piece, which will be up on our website, which should go live. We are making a whole new website, which will be available at the old URL, historicbostons.org. But Lance will have a written piece on there in a couple of weeks when we're live. I look forward to that very much. A stunning article on the true history of Deer Island during King Philip's War. We've read so much about Deer Island. We've been there, but it will be perfectly fine to have someone actually write about it. That'll be great. So the way we're going to deal with questions, if you have a question, raise your hand, unmute your microphone if it's muted. James will recognize you, bring you to the fore so that you can present your question directly to us in the audience and to Lance. And then when your question has been answered, preferably request that you again mute yourself so there's not a lot of background noise and Lance can answer the question. So take it away, Lance. Do we have any raised hands, James?
Yes, we do. I'm looking at Michael. I just asked him to unmute.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, like in the Southeast, a lot of the Native groups tried working through the European courts to get their lands back. And you mentioned the mnemonic devices of the wampum belts and how those were used basically as kind of like charters or land grants. I was kind of wondering, like, did the Native groups ever try using the wampum belts as maybe some sort of way of proving their rights to the lands to Europeans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, I would answer that by saying that in fact that they did. And I think the Europeans realized that this was that within those belts was a code of certain treaties between the tribes. Winthrop is famously known for actually he had two counterfeit wampum belts that he tried to use as an exchange with some of the native tribes. So I think that they knew that there was this concept of how we use those belts. The fundamental problem was that was a language, right? That was a kind of a written language, which was so alien and foreign to them that it just didn't fit into their thought system, right? That, you know, they had everything written on pen and paper and a deed like that. So it would have been interesting, Michael, that if it could have gone the other way, that the trading of lands and the deeds and the land rights and land uses could have followed the concept of these wampum belts, because we do know that the English really understood the power and also the value of wampum for Native Americans, because they actually started trading fur, they started trading other things in wampum. So, you know, there was a great fur trade that happened between Indigenous people in the Northeast and the settlers who came. Beaver was a commodity. Everybody wanted beaver, right? And they had exhausted the beaver populations in Europe. So the American beaver, who was very similar to the European beaver, became such a hot commodity. And the Europeans quickly learned, not just the beaver trade, but other trades, how valuable wampum was as a currency and as a way of doing things, that they started trading with the natives with wampum. So I believe there was an awareness about it. It just was not, it was something that was so alien. And I've said many times to the partnership that these were irreconcilable thought systems. The Europeans couldn't possibly imagine this kind of way that could be a legal way of doing a transaction. Even though they recognized the value of wampum as a currency with the natives, they couldn't recognize it as a way of saying, we understand that this is a way of creating or formulating a treaty with the Native Americans. And that was established at the beginning when it was decided that if the Indigenous people wanted, and probably more historians could get deeper into this than I can, but if they wanted to interact with them, they had to do it in the court system that was set up and using the language that the colonists were using, which obviously was then the King's English.
Okay. If Michael's satisfied, then Roxanne.
Hi, I'm Roxanne Reddington Wild, and I'm a member of the partnership. And Lance actually mostly answered sort of my broad question that he and I have talked on before in his comments just now. My background's as a historical anthropologist, and I'm fascinated by worldview. And I agree with Lance that the English and indeed the European colonists who came here were unable to recognize that others might have a worldview totally different than theirs. Lance, you had made a comment towards the end of your presentation about worldview. And I guess my question therefore becomes, is there do all parties, I don't think it's necessarily just binary, Native peoples today and colonial descendants today, such as myself, but do all parties, is there a chance that worldviews, we can now understand each other's worldviews somewhat better and perhaps come to more respect, and especially on the part of the colonists' descendants, such as myself, a better recognition and understanding of how to treat fairly and behave fairly towards Native peoples? Or is there still too much of a inability to understand?
I think more and more, this is just my opinion with my interaction with non-Native people, Roxanne. I think more and more people are coming to that realization. I think that there's an enormous amount of, just like we see with African or Black, there's an enormous amount of reckoning that's coming about. Oh my God, look at what happened. And this is true with Indigenous people around the world, right? When you think of things about, there's nobody there so we can take their land, or if you think of other things like, the doctrine of discovery, what the extraordinary pain that religious ideas brought upon other people. But I do think people are starting to say, can we come together and have an understanding about how we interact with each other? But I think a lot of people carry a lot of guilt, like historic guilt as well as historic trauma about those things that, when we do important things like the work that we're doing here, and when other organizations say, maybe the story we've always heard is not the story. Let's sit down and say, we made mistakes. How can we fix this? How can we get on with ours? And one other point to that, Roxanne, is I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that, my goodness, what if we as humans had followed these indigenous ways of being? Would the earth be in the trouble that it is in? So I started earlier by saying that, if we broke things, if we took things out of balance, there would be consequences, because if we hurt the earth, we hurt ourselves, because the people believe they were the earth, right? So we've broken the turtle's back, right? This is what we believe. And so that, the turtle's starting to drown, right? What if we could understand, and again, it's as far-fetched an idea that, a virgin had a child and still remained a virgin as it is to believe that the earth was on the back of a turtle, right? I mean, really think about that for a minute. But I think we're starting to say, what if we could have understood that you don't deplete all the resources, that you move on, you let a forest grow again, or that you let the ocean replenish itself? Would we be in this problem, in this situation? So I think there are things that we're starting to say, we should look at that, and we should consider, finding a place of peace. And just one more question. I know that Michael, you had another question about did natives recognize the origin of some of those diseases, and the answer to that is yes, because here's what happened. First of all, that was catastrophic. Two things happened that were very catastrophic. At the time, just before the Europeans came, or the Puritans came, there were two things that had happened in 3 or 4 years, 16, 17, 18, that area. There was a catastrophic plague that annihilated many of the eastern woodland and shore Indians. But at that same time, there was what scientists are now calling a little ice age. So the temperatures were extraordinary, and there were issues about that. There wasn't as much food, there wasn't as much things. But the natives realized that the settlers were not dying. So their God must be a different God or a better God than our God, because we have done something to displease our gods, because we're dying and they're not dying. But they could never get, because they didn't understand that they didn't have a way to fight off that. And maybe part of their cleanliness, the fact that they bathed all the time. You know, there's Europeans who have written that they bathe 3 or 4 times a day, right? So, you know, yeah, they were aware that there was something different that the Europeans survived, but we didn't. But they just didn't know what it was. And we know as time went on, the Europeans realized that, right? Because there were certain things done with smallpox on blankets and other things that decimated other, you know, as they had gone further west, decimated other natives. So there was an understanding that maybe they had because their God was protecting them, and our gods and our spirits weren't protecting us and we're dying. So yeah, there was somewhat of an understanding.
Well, more than that, though, was it an understanding, though, that those diseases were somehow connected to the animals that they were bringing? Because with the Europeans, the reason they had these, like smallpox, and that was because they lived so long with domestic animals.
Oh, okay. So no, I don't think that. I don't believe, and I've never read anything that links those two things together. It was just a linking of that they, for some reason, you know, and obviously, you know, that, I mean, for the Europeans, I mean, they had issues with disease and so forth, but they tended to survive a little bit more because they certainly had the immunities that Native Americans just didn't have. So, but no, that link, I don't think that link, I've never read anything about that. There was a knowledge, the link between, you know, the animals and the diseases that they carried and those things that jumped to humans was there. So
the next hand I saw was Andrew.
Lance, I enjoyed your presentation very much. It was very eye-opening. We may put it that way.
Thank you.
One of the things that struck me was when you beginning, we talking about, you know, the turtle story, the turtle creation, and it reflects well on the Native Americans' feeling for the earth. We've gentlemen who've done a bad job maintaining the earth, so we're suffering that climate change and whatnot. So I think it would be very helpful to keep making this well known to people and get people to think more about maybe they had something, maybe they were right about some of these things, and maybe help us push back before we really destroy everything. So I just think it was that's another way of thinking, creation thing, to help us think about our earth, and we need to be better stewards of it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And yeah, that was the thing, is that I think that there was a greater sense, because there was less of a sense of the earth as a possession, something you could buy and sell, something that you could cut up into pieces and not have a consequence for not being stewards of the earth. And again, you know, tribal boundaries were set up, and people in those tribes realized that this was the part of the earth we were responsible for. But they also realized that they had to, that resources were finite. Think about that. Even 400 years ago, even 500 years ago, Indigenous people, not just in the Americas, but everywhere, realized that resources were finite. So how do we make sure we don't just deplete everything? Well, we have to move and let the earth rest. We have to be able to let things come back. So there was less of a sense, you know, we always talk about the ecological Indian, and then that's what that's called. But there was a sense of a responsibility to that, because again, the idea of there's a consequence to hurting the earth, because we're part of the earth. So if we hurt that, eventually it comes back to us, right? It shows up with us. And I mean, you can look at that, you know, and how we look at other things within the world. And we talk about, you know, the sins of the father, you know, in biblical ideas and so forth. But the idea that we have to be careful and we have to do the right thing. And then that there is everything was sacred, right? So there's a sacred way that you go to hunt things. There's a sacred thing that you do. Powwows were sacred things in Native America in those days. Powwows were things that we did to thank the earth, to thank the gods for giving us bountiful things, for making sure that we had crops that would see us through the winter, making sure that the springtime we had the seeds to plant. But all those things were sacred. And you know, even the idea that we didn't waste things, that you couldn't waste things, that you found a way to use things. Think about the fact that wampum is basically the shell of a quahog. So you have that purple part, and then you have the white. That it wasn't wasted. That was made into beads. It was made into the belts that I talk about. It was made, everything was used in a way that didn't waste it. So yeah, I think there's part of that I think, you know, we could learn a great lesson from Indigenous people all over the world. I don't know if it's too late, you know, I mean, none of us really know, but it is something to think about.
Thank you. How much was the population decimated but through all this? How large was the population in say New England or Massachusetts Native American people, do you think?
There's converging beliefs about how large the population was. So, you know, so some people say it was as low as 120,000 in Massachusetts. Some people say that, you know, and there are some historians now are saying, no, it was much greater than that. But whole villages were wiped out. There were whole entire villages. So if you think of the Massachusetts tribe, for example, you know, there were many villages that made up of the Massachusetts tribe. Some of those villages were completely wiped out. So, you know, and again, not to their fault, except for the only fault was the idea that you could come into a land where there were people and decide that that land was yours. But, you know, when the Puritans got here and others, there were villages that they were like ghost towns because everybody was dead. So they thought, well, we'll set up shop here. You know, it's kind of like, you know, nobody's at their summer homes in northern New England right now. So it seems like nobody's there. But the reality was that many villages were wiped out. So the tribes were decimated. Very decimated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, I would like to pull a question out of chat because this was put before either of the hands that are up. This is by Amy Golani, and sorry if I mispronounced. That was there any discussion among natives of different regions about dealing with these Europeans? I'm thinking of upstate New York natives who had a strong beaver trade with the Dutch. Did the New England tribes communicate with the upstate New York tribes to compare notes? Thanks.
I don't know if they ever compared notes, but, you know, unfortunately, my relative, Philip, who was a 10th uncle, has the most notorious, not necessarily deserved, but the most notorious profile in history in terms of a Native American. I mean, he's been called so many things. He was just defending his homeland, right? I don't know that there was a communication between them other than the tribes that became part of what became the Wampanoag Confederation or Phillips tribes in and around the area that was closest to him. I do know this, that wasn't the first war. That was one of many. So it did eventually spiral out to other parts of New England and the Northeast, where the European settlers and the colonial people were fighting everywhere with Native Americans as things change. So I don't know that we have any type of a record. And one of the most difficult things with Indigenous people, especially in New England, is because we didn't have a written language. We relied heavily on what the colonists wrote about us, right? So they, in many ways, documented some of the history. But there's nothing that says, you know, Philip was communicating with the Odina or with others, but we do know that he was communicating with the Narragansetts and with the Pequots and with the Pecasets, who were allies of his, with the Nemaskets, who were allies. And some of those tribes were not friendly with him. The Nipmunks, some of the Nipmunks were, some of them weren't. So, but as it was mostly regional that those conversations were going on in and around the 1670s and so forth.
Patrick Hamilton would be next.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Patrick.
This is a fascinating presentation. Thanks very much for giving us the opportunity, and forgive the canine staff here. They get upset when I'm talking to other people. And please don't misunderstand my questions. I don't mean to at all excuse away European colonists or colonizers' ignorance or misunderstanding, but I am curious about exploring how that misunderstanding may have also operated in three related areas that have been that have come to mind by your presentation. One is in one of your first slides. I think you talked about cleared hunting parks.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what that means and to what degree that may have given the appearance of open space.
Sure.
Secondly, you've also talked about villages destroyed by smallpox or what have you.
Yeah.
As I recall, the Pilgrims, what they called Plymouth, was in fact the Plymouth plantation was the site of a village that had been wiped out. And I was wondering if, either out of respect for the dead or any superstition, because of course I assume they had no understanding of what had all of a sudden killed so many of their people, were those kind of spaces, those villages of dead people, were they in fact abandoned, or was there a notion, either out of respect or out of superstition, or was there a notion that no, that's still part of the land we occupy? And thirdly, between tribes, especially tribes that were not necessarily confederated, if you will, but were perhaps slightly aggressive towards one another, were there perhaps buffer zones or no man's lands to sort of keep them apart between those spaces that they considered their traditional homelands? And might those buffer zones or no man's land, literally sort of no man's land, have also been mistaken as, oh, well, that's no man's land, therefore we can take that. So thank you for taking my question.
Sure. And yeah, thank you for those questions. Those are great questions. So to start with the last one, I think that your conclusion about, those buffer zones, and there were places between, I mean, it's kind of like, look at, Burlington, Vermont and Whitefield, New Hampshire, right? There's a lot of space in between there where there's nothing, right? So yeah, I mean, the assumption that, that no one's here, or this doesn't belong to someone, certainly would have probably come into the minds of anybody who was exploring a new territory. As far as the idea of those villages that were decimated, Patrick, there were so few people to be able to populate some of those other places that, I think that that the reality is that, they were left, they were just there, they were abandoned. So that wasn't some idea that, they thought, oh, we'll come back to this place. There wasn't enough people, in my opinion, and, I don't know if there's other natives on here who could attest to that. There weren't enough people to come back to that. I mean, there was so much destruction that those small villages, and remember, they were tight-knit communities because most of them were families, right? So, the Picassids they were all hereditarily tied to each other and so forth, that, and they had suffered so much that trying to keep the places where they were together was enough for them, that they weren't thinking, oh, we got to go back to that village over there, or we have to go back to that place, because there were so few of them left to do that. There were several thousand of them, but it wasn't the hundreds of thousands that used to be there to be able to inhabit those places. So, I can see how it would have been perfectly understandable for someone to say, oh, this is empty land. But we have to step that all the way back to the idea that, let's just say an alien ship comes down and decides that, half of the Green Mountains, which there are no people in, they can take over the land. So the premise of, the whole premise of how did we get the land, is something that we have to consider. But by all means, I think that the fact that there were whole villages that were wiped out, it would be easy to see why people say, well, there's nobody here. This isn't occupied. This land isn't occupied. And that idea of, vacant land and remember this too, the other thing is, because we moved seasonally, there were places where there were actually no traces that there were people there. This idea of, you know, moving seasonally and so forth. Land was cleared, it was cleaned up, it was taken care of. So that could have been misinterpreted. Your first question, which I believe was about the hunting parks. So, you know, I mean, natives burnt the underbush, they cleared the underground and so forth, so that they could create areas where, you know, animals could easily graze. And it was easier for them to be able to hunt them, so that there wasn't the thicket of the forest that people assumed was in New England. So that's what those spaces were. Those cleared hunting spaces were actually areas that natives used to actually hunt some of the game that they hunted.
If I could just add,
Sure.
I often tell my kids, who are now young adults, that the notion that there were wide open spaces, that the land was not occupied, is totally belied by the place names that we today simply take for granted and think of as American, but are Native American, whether it's Massachusetts, Neponset, Pasumset, all these on Long Island, Massapequa, Ohio, Mississippi, Minnesota, Dakota, all of these place names. Gee, how did they get those place names in names that are clearly not English, unless there were people living on them? I mean, Kentucky, it just goes on and on and on. And so even the place names we consider to be so sort of prototypical American are in fact the evidence that the land was not empty.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Very, very, very good point.
Okay, Jacob was the next person. Jacob just disappeared when I said
Sorry. I hit the stop
Hi,
video instead of the unmute. I was going to ask a pretty similar question to Patrick about how the cleared hunting parks were managed, but I'll pivot from there to ask if you have any examples of areas that became English settlements that started out as those cleared hunting preserves.
Specific names of places, I would have to get back to you on that one, because yeah, I can't think of, you know, I mean, I can give you names of places that are obvious in the content, you know, things like that, but I'd have to get back to you.
Or I guess how we know that land that was used as a hunting park was given or designated for use by the English.
So here's another thing to that point, that you know, when it doesn't necessarily mean that because they started there, or that they stayed in those particular places. So, you know, the areas in and around Boston, there were probably several of them that were cleared. Salem, the North Shore. I have to look into that. We could probably put it back, you know, append it to this after, but that would be something I'd have to look at. But that was an easy place to say, okay, you can picture tents here, if you will. You know, we're not using this right now, so here. And we always have to remember from this point, it's not as though they didn't, you know, and I don't know that we can say this here. It's not as though they didn't think, okay, so, you know, we want to bring them into our collaborative network. The idea was that, okay, well, you know, these people are here, it looks like they're staying, you know, let's see how we can incorporate them into our network. So the idea that the English were there or the European were there, sort of the natives thought of it as just the way they thought of when they had trading agreements with other tribes, like, because they didn't, I think we often don't understand the fundamental differences between how the language barrier, first of all, extraordinary difference, and then the fundamental difference about how Native American people saw the land. Like, of course, we will share this, and the bounty that comes from this, we'll all share together. Like, they never saw the Europeans as not brothers or sisters, just like they never saw, deer or otter, not as brothers or sisters. It's funny, I was, before this presentation, I was on one of the social media places, and one of my friends took a picture of some bison, and his caption was "visiting with the relatives," because that concept of everyone belongs, and that if you're going to keep the balance, you have to understand that there's this mutual give and take. So, because there was such an irreconcilable differences between thought systems, such extraordinary irreconcilable, that that idea that we're sharing this with you, but you're not keeping it. And then when it became clear that it wasn't the same way from how the Europeans are, you're giving us this, and we're going to live here, and we're going to plant the plants we plant, and we're going to have, cows and sheep and all those things. So right from the beginning, that caused so much friction, in the sense of how they live. So that, here's a park, you can put your trailer here, but eventually, are you staying? Oh, you're staying, so you're going to join what we are. And the thought was, no, we're gonna take this. But I could get back to you with some other, or we could post it somehow as part of this presentation, so you could see where some of those specific places were.
Thanks.
Okay, Michael was next again.
Hi.
Yeah, I just have, I like the way the readings brought out the sort of the politics of memory, the difference between space and place, and the way that Europeans are looking at the history of this area versus the way the natives look at it. And King Phillips becomes this quaint little name that is just associated with shopping centers and all this. So I'm just wondering, I got kind of like a two-part question. First part is, what initiatives are Native groups of the Northeast doing to sort of reclaim this past and sort of give an idea of the Native view of these events and what happened? And the second part I have is, I'm an ethno-historian, so I teach classes. I'm kind of like half an anthropologist, half a historian. And I noticed, like in one of the readings, they took to task of Francis Jennings, the invasion of America, saying that maybe his way of looking at what went out was a little too simplistic. So I was wondering, like, do you have any suggestions on like any sources that I could use as an educator, even to get this story out there, so it's not just the European story, but I'm also including the Native view of things?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and thank you for that. Some of the suggested readings on my last slide, which will be available, I can even email you some of those, which sort of give a Native point of view of that particular thing. I think that Natives are really trying hard these days to tell our side of the story without, we're not here to blame people or accuse people. We're here to say there is history was written by the winners. That doesn't make it the truth. It makes it true for the people who wrote history. And between that and this, there's the truth, right? So, there's a number of things. I mean, there's a great book by Kathleen Bragdon, which is Native People of Southern New England before, I think it's like between 1500 and 1630 or something like that, which gives such an in-depth understanding of Native Americans. I don't know if you've ever read Lisa Brooks's Our Beloved Kin, but it's a story of King Philip's War from the point of view of Weetamo. Weetamo was the squaw sachem of the Pecasset tribe, and it talks about everything leading up to that, what happened, how she as a female was involved in this war, and it looks at it from a very different point of view, and that point of view is very, very Native. I mean, she gives the colonist side, but it's extraordinary in the depth of how it talks about the richness and what really happened. Dr. Jeremy Banks writes a lot of books about Native Americans, New Light on an Old Colony. He wrote Indian Deeds. There's a number of things that are out there. Ed Quill wrote a book about the Matakeesit and the other Massachusetts tribes and Chickatawbit and those things, that really from the point of view, Ed Quill was an editor of the Boston Globe. His book is fascinating, the context of the story, saying here's an alternative way of looking at this, and looking at this from our angle. And then of course, we're always, as the smaller tribes, the ones that aren't necessarily federally recognized, there's a lot of tribal people in this area and all about that, are starting to emerge and starting to put their stories down and starting to make their footprint. But I think those are suggestions. There's another great book called, I think it's called Discovering Indigenous Lands, and it's written by three or four authors, but it's fascinating. It looks at how those things happen. And then the last book, the last one, and I can't remember the name, it's the United States of America from an Indigenous point of view, and it's on that list there. And that is it's a difficult book to read because it really is painfully honest. But I think that you might find that as a teacher, and you'd find it fascinating about the story. And it starts from how it starts from following the corn, the idea about what corn was, to all the way straight through to present day. They're There by Tommy Orange. Excellent book. I would recommend I don't know who you're teaching, fascinating book about what happened and where we are today with some of that stuff. But I would recommend some of that. I can send you some other stuff too that might be helpful for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, also any sort of primary native sources I could kind of look towards?
Yeah, well, Tommy Orange is native. Lisa Brooks is native. There's the people who wrote Discovering Indigenous Lands, they're all native. So there's some things. And, the Pequot Museum is a great place to go. I don't know where you live, if you're anywhere in the area, but this image behind me is from the Pequot Museum. The Pequot Museum has reconstructed a native village from the 1600s. There's a wealth of information, Indigenous stuff there at that museum. I recommend that highly for anybody who wants the Mashantucket Pequot Museum down in Mashantucket. If you really want to be immersed in that, if you want to see a native village come to life, the 1600s village, they have a full village, cast just like, all these are live casts of people. That it's a fascinating place. So, but the 3 or 4 of those people that I told you, they're certainly native. I mean, you can look at other things. There are a number of even the Pilgrim Museum. They have some great stuff. You can go down to Plymouth Plantation, but I think that, those are some of the things I would recommend.
Okay, thanks.
Tommy Orange is native in that book. I mean, if you really want to have a gripping, extraordinary understanding of the native side, it's quite a book, and I think that your students would be fascinated by the alternative narrative.
Okay, well, I live in Illinois, so I mean, sort of what I'm up against is most of my students, I think you mentioned this before, I have a lot of students who simply don't even realize Native Americans still exist.
Yeah.
Which is, I think kind of mind-blowing, but, it's very common in this area. So, it's just this idea of not only the history, but I want to get through to them that, Native Americans aren't just these things that were relegated to 200, 300 years ago, but they're still vibrant, very active, very alive communities today.
Yeah. That's a good point. And, even more so here in New England, that Native people have kind of sort of become there are very few historians or so forth that write about, this was we were the people of the first encounter. Like, everything was tried here. Deer Island and the imprisonment of the Native Americans on Deer Island is one of the harbor islands in the Boston Harbor. And during King Phillips War, all the praying Indians that were in these villages that converted to Christianity, that took the mantle of trying to be like the Puritans, were summarily marched across Massachusetts and imprisoned on Deer Island, and up to 500 of them starved to death or froze to death on Deer Island. And not many people know that happened. You know, I call that America's first concentration camp. I know that riles a lot of people, but that's exactly what it was. And, you know, but New England Indians in general, New England natives, we're kind of the forgotten natives. It's like people don't even know that, you know, if it, you know, they might know of the Mashpee tribe, they might know of the Mashantucket Pequots or the other Connecticut tribe, the can't think of the name right off the top of my head, but the Mohegans, they might know of them. But when it comes to all of the rest of us that are still here, that may not have federal recognition, but we're still here, the Picassets, the Matakeesit, the Nemaskets, there's so many of us that are still here. And this is a time where, you know, people are starting to say, just like you wouldn't say that, you know, I mean, we didn't disappear. You know, we're still trying to assert ourselves. So yes, we're multicultural and multiracial, but we identify with our native side, and we're still here, and that story needs to be told.
Okay, first time check, we're at 8:30. I will stay here as long as you will, Lance, but I just wanted to do a time check. Roxanne was the next person in queue.
Roxanne Reddington Wild or Roxanne? I have another Roxanne Young Perry, and there's another hyphenated Roxanne here. Which Roxanne?
This is you, Roxanne.
This is me, Roxanne Reddington Wild. Okay. It's, by the way, hello, Roxanne Young Perry. It's delightful to meet another hyphenated.
By the way, Roxanne Young Perry is actually my sister. So.
Oh my God. Well, better yet. Any rate, I really enjoyed especially the reading that you found, that you put forward, Springer's reading on American Indians. And reading one of his things, my specialty is actually Scottish and British social structure, historical social structure about this period. And I had a realization for myself that the way that the colonists, who happen to be my ancestors, were conceptualizing the ownership of the land by the native peoples here was really, they were reading into it the concept of lordship. Springer's saying on, I don't know what page 62, the tribes were seen as roughly equivalent to small European principalities governed by a sachem or a sagamore. The tribe was a landowning unit, but the sachem had the right to sell, give away, or lease the land. And this is actually the way that at least the Scots and also the English were conceptualizing lordship. So sachem as lord, they were, my sudden insight hypothesis is, they looked and said, oh, that person is the lord of the land. Yes, other people have rights under that person, but the sachem as lord can hand it on, can alienate it. And I think that may have been one of the fundamental misunderstandings or unconscious assumptions, because the English could only really see things from their own worldview.
Yes. And isn't that spot on? That's exactly right. And isn't that the way? I mean, we all live. We all live out of what we believe, and in living out of what we believe and what we think, that's how we show up in the world, right? So that's exactly right. They could only conceptualize it from from how they understood things. That they couldn't conceptual. I mean, I imagine maybe if somehow they had got, you know, if they had become like some of these explorers who came to New England and stayed with the Indians and were here for years, and they sort of said, oh, I get these people, but they were conceptualizing everything from what they knew, and they were living out of those beliefs. And out of those beliefs, we all live out of our beliefs, right? What we believe is how we see the world. And, you know, and it takes a while. And in this case, there wasn't that flexibility to say, wait a minute, maybe we should step back and maybe look at this differently. That's exactly.
That was the criminal sin, was that unwillingness, that inability to even conceive that one could step back a bit and say, perhaps there's another way of viewing it.
Right. And there were some that did that, you know, I mean, there were some that had more of I I guess I would say an affection, saying, wait a minute. You know, I would call them the liberal thinkers. You know, there weren't a lot of them, but there were a few, what I would call the liberal thinkers, who said, maybe I'm going to take the side of the native. But that was, you know, I mean, we live out of what we believe and what we're taught and what we know. And until we're willing to look at those thoughts and say, you know, the concept of calling somebody a savage because they dress in a loincloth, but they have sophisticated trading routes and they have sophisticated rituals is, you know, you got to look at that and say, are they really, because, you know, and look at what we're up against, right? The Puritans were dressed from here down, right? I mean, they covered the body, that, you know, even in the summertime, you know, they're in black and, you know, hats on their heads and everything. So, you know, they look at these natives and the natives have no shame. Why should they be ashamed? They didn't have a shame of the body. You know, there was an idea of, you know, what the body was to the Puritans and even to the Pilgrims who were here before them, that didn't actually say, you know, because they live in huts and, you know, they don't have floors, they have their floor, you know, and they move their huts and, you know, they eat on the ground. And no, they didn't eat with their hands. They used the shells. Another way of using the shells, they used the shells. So they didn't, but, you know, it wasn't too far before that English people ate with their hands as well. So, you know, there's this evolution. But I think that they just couldn't conceptualize that we should take a step back here. And I don't, to me, there was an issue of time. Do we want to take the time we need to try to figure out these people? I think that was another, that's my opinion, is it takes some time to understand people, right? You just don't go to the book and and read a book in Chinese if you don't understand the language. And part of understanding the language is understanding the people. The other thing too is, I think the only one who actually, or the few people actually learned the language. So, you know, God bless God bless Eliot, right? He translated the Bible. You know, there was a reason he did that. I mean, I think there was a lot of affection that he showed towards natives, and he was really, really, really disturbed by the treatment of the natives that were put on Deer Island. He tried really, really hard against all odds to try to help them. Imagine this, that it's October, we're in the middle of a little ice age. You are marched summarily across the state of Massachusetts in the freezing cold and put on an island with no supplies, no ability to build houses, but there are very few of them who tried to understand or tried to speak or tried to learn native languages. Whereas native people were required to learn English. They were required because all the court systems were set up in that. So I think if there had been a little bit more of a push and pull there, maybe there would have been a little bit more understanding. Do I think what happened was bound to happen? It's not a speculation, it happened. Whether it was supposed to or not, it happened. Could it have been a little bit less shocking to native people? Maybe, but it happened that way because there was, you know, there was that lack of let's stop and understand each other in this way.
Thank you.
Okay, Naomi's next in line.
Hi, thank you for
Hi,
calling
Naomi.
on me, and thank you for the fantastic presentation. I work as a tour guide in Boston. I have for over 30 years now. We have a Freedom Trail tour, we have a Women's Heritage tour, we have a Black Heritage tour. We do have a literature tour and an architecture tour. I would love to see something come in that involved the Native American history in Boston. I know we have a plaque with Native Americans and William Blackstone at the bottom of the common where the fish weir was set up. There's a mural of John Eliot in the State House. When you get to the waterfront, you can see Deer Island from the Christopher Columbus Waterfront Park. And in between those sites that I know of, there are some other kind of vague and hard to find references to Native Americans, but it would be great to involve the culture, the food, how the land was used. I know the Shawmut Peninsula is named after the Shawmut Native Americans who had been here. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility of developing a walk through town. We deal with a lot of 7th and 8th graders, especially who are interested in the history of Boston. And I'd love to be able to offer them, or have someone offer them and refer them to a Native American retrospective experience, or just an exposure to the culture. I'm tired myself of just focusing on the Freedom Trail. As I say, I've added as many Native American and other aspects of society into it as I possibly can, but a focus would be really great.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're trying to commit to and work on with the partnership here is some type of physical tour, some type of thing in and around Boston and other places that would incorporate the things that you speak about. So we're trying to work on that. You know, I've talked to the partnership several times about how could we do this, how could we put this and that. So I think that's something that they would love to do, not just in the greater Boston area, but if you look in southern Massachusetts and so forth. That picture that I showed on slide 1, I don't know if you were here for that, of that cave, that's King Phillips Cave. There are certain areas that, you know, again, when the land still holds in plain sight in some places remnants and artifacts and proof of who we were, you know, not so much in greater Boston, because as you know, Boston was filled in, you know, I mean, Back Bay used to be the Bay, and, you know, the 3 hills were cut down, and, you know, it's ironic that, Winthrop, you know, wanted to create a shining city on a hill, and then they tore the hills down. But yes, I think
that's part of the tour, right?
Yes. But that's a great idea, and we hope to be able to bring something like that so that you could use that.
I grew up in Waltham, where we'd find arrowheads in the woods all the time.
All the time.
Burlington, where I used to love to hide in this little cave by a wall from the Francis Wyman Road. Now, you're probably familiar with that. It just got some exposure, and the owners of the property would kick us out. But it was a lovely little enclosure there. So but I know that that's outside of the city. But just a quick comment that people come into the city, they're spending their time in the city, and I know there's so much outside of the city. So, But to have something in the city with references and hey, keep my name.
Yes, that's a great idea. It would add to, and it should be done.
Great. It should be available. Thank you. And now with the new department Secretary of the Interior, maybe we'll get some more exposure all around the country too.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
So I do not see any more hands. I know that I just saw Michael put another question into chat. Would you like to say it, Michael?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is kind of just in some ways sort of a selfish question, because I'm working with Mississippian artifacts and Mississippian peoples, and I'm basically right now traveling all over the eastern United States, looking at all these Adena, Hopewell, Mississippian sites. I'm just wondering, like, what is the relationship of, say, your people to the Mississippian or the Adena, the Hopewell interaction spheres? I mean, were you guys historically a part of any of that you know of? Or is it Fort Ancient?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're still learning the reaches of, you know, of our people. I would have to ask, you know, I'd have to put that question to our tribal historian and some of the other tribes and their historians. But we do know that they weren't confined just to New England, that they had extraordinary trade routes. Again, as I said in the beginning, that reached all the way down to South America. And, you know, that corn came up from South America to New England. But I'd have to look into that. You know, I would say we learn, you know, constantly more and more about where those connections were and how interconnected, you know, the tribes were. So that would be a question I'd have to ask somebody, and it would be interesting to find out. So yeah, we can look into that.
Okay, thanks.
And I see Patrick has his hand up.
Thank you. Maybe it's a good thing that we're maybe ending on what may be a very un-PC question. And let me also say, since my name was said, my full name, Patrick Hamilton, despite the name that sounds like my people might have come over on the Mayflower or a boat right behind the Mayflower, my people came here on a boat, but it was 1949, and it was, you know, so I'm very much of a newcomer, first generation American. But nevertheless, I'm very proud of being an American, or have been until, and And I am very much supportive of things like Black Lives Matter and becoming aware of those things and more sensitized to those things, including personally as a former federal prosecutor. But I've got to admit that I'm troubled by slavery. African-American slavery is being referred to as America's original sin, because I happen to believe that the original sin is what we did the minute we arrived here. And again, I arrived in 1949, but I think you know what I mean, that we Europeans, we white men did. And it was what we started and continued for many centuries to the Native Americans.
Yeah.
And that, not to take anything away from Black Lives Matter or from the terrors and the horrors of slavery, but our original sin is, as a nation, is what we've done and the neglect we continue to bestow upon the first Americans. If you don't mind, if you don't want to speak about it, that's fine, but I'd be curious to hear your observations.
Well, I mean, again, the same thing that it doesn't belittle or in any way detract from what, slavery and what happened. And Native Americans were enslaved as well. So, King Phillips War ended in a lot of Native Americans being sent to the West Indies and to other places as slaves. But I do think that sometimes, we forget that indeed the conquest of a continent that was populated by, there are some people who say millions and millions and millions of people. The idea that, and it's not, and the idea that somebody had the right, to take that land, to come in and say, you're inferior to us because you don't dress like us and you don't look like us and you don't think like us. And so, yeah, I think that was something that, and I think that places like this, like, the people here at the partnership are trying to reckon with that. They're very sensitive to that and trying to say, how do we re-examine that? How do we tell the truth? Because, the idea of this glorious Thanksgiving, and even if you look at that picture, the Native Americans are sitting on the ground in loincloths in November. How disrespectful is that to these people who saved these people who came over? Some of them, if you look at the Pilgrims, half of them were dead. We nursed them back to health. So I think that you're absolutely right. It's a delicate question, but it's a question that, we have to say, this is really where it started. And we have to be adult enough to say, we're not going to run out of the room and scream and yell and say, no, it happened. That's what happened. That's what really, really happened. And until we're brave enough to stand up to it, until we're brave enough to say, what do we do from here? So, one of the things that I'm passionate about is, I think, the three ways in which Native Americans are, underrepresented. And you look at what's happened to some of our communities with COVID-19, how destructive this virus has been to Indigenous people who are often forgotten and left on reservations out in the middle of nowhere. But I think we have to come together and we have to say, how do we help empower you? Because in many ways, the things that we denied you of, things like land, things like healthcare, things like adequate education, things like housing. And I'm not saying handouts, because I don't want a handout. My nation doesn't want a handout. We want people to say, we want to work with you to empower you, to help you empower yourself, not just, as a handout, because we recognize some things were done that we have to fess up to. So I agree with you. I think sometimes we forget that. I think even sometimes in some of our movements, we forget that, Native people should be involved in Indigenous Lives Matter as well, just like, Black Lives Matter and things like that. But we do have to we do have to help, thank you, Roxanne, achieve equity. That's a very good statement. So that's where I would say that. I hope that answered your question, or I hope you feel like I said what you were thinking.
Thank you.
Sure. Roxanne, you wanted to, I don't know, James, do we have more here, or?
There's one, Gail Kummer has been nice enough to post this twice. Sorry for missing it the first time. Gail is interested if there are any books for young teenagers to introduce them to some of this material.
So I would recommend Tommy Orange's There.
That's a pretty firm answer. And the only hand,
and you teenagers will get a very, very good, strong understanding of this stuff, and it was written with them in mind.
the only hand we have up at the moment is Roxanne Reddington-Weil.
Yes.
So Patrick's question about slavery and Lance's point that needs to be repeated many times, that Native peoples here were enslaved, really ties into the next discussion that the partnership will be holding, which I am shamelessly plugging because I'm leading it. On April 14th, I'm leading a discussion on the Body of Liberties, which was the first New England law code developed by Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then sort of its sequel, the General Laws and Liberties. The reason why I have become fascinated with it is because while it's seen as the foundation in many ways for our grand and glorious American liberties, it also is the first place that slavery is encoded in law in basically what has become the United States. And that the one tiny little subclause that basically encodes slavery was, I believe, put in there because at that point, Massachusetts Bay Puritans were in the process of trying to enslave Native peoples from around here. So there is really a direct tie, as Patrick was pointing out, between America's original sin, slavery, and frankly, as I said before, what my ancestors how my ancestors were legalizing the persecution and the elimination of Native peoples here.
Great.
I do not see any more questions that have not been answered. Do you want to make this a last call?
Yeah. Michael, do you want to?
Oh, just one last thing. I was just wondering, are there any Native presses that put out any books or materials?
Yeah, I'd have to. There's a whole. If you want to leave an email, I don't know if we have your email, but I can. There's a number of publications in places. I mean, Indian Country Today has links to Indigenous resources and presses and so forth, and that would be to me, Michael, that would be a great resource for you to go and look and see. It's Indian Country Today. You can, I think that the website, I just Googled the website, and there's a number of things there that I think would be helpful for you to look at some of the books and articles and things that some Native people across the country are putting out. They have a great library of things.
Okay, thanks.
Then let me close off. This has been a remarkable session. I want to thank everybody who has helped, everybody who's been here, everybody who's asked questions. This is what the partnership does, what we try to do, how we learn, how we commemorate more than celebrate, trying to understand what happened, why it happened, what we can do about it, and where we can go from here. So thank everybody. I will be sending out to everyone who attended a short survey asking how we did and all that stuff, but mostly the survey is about the last question, which says, what else would you like to see the partnership take on and do and learn about? And I encourage everyone who is listening to answer that question, because we live with that, and it's an important thing to us. There'll also be a reading list that will included with that, and this video will be available within 3 or 4 days, and will certainly be available when we go live with the new website, which is intended to be really a full statement of how much we've learned in 20 years of doing this, and how much more we have to learn, and how we're going to get there. So thank you, everybody. And Lance, there's nothing more that I can say other than it's so fine knowing you, and thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Thank everyone for attending. It was great.
Yes, thank you.
Marvelous.
It was all nice meeting you folks, people. Thanks so much.
Do you have any like Algonquin language classes or anything that your group gets out? You know?
I know that the Mashpee Wampanoag have I don't know if they have if they have classes, but they I'd have to look into that. The Mashantucket Pequot have classes, but I don't know that they have them that they expose out with it. The problem is with the fact that there's no one single language. There is one book I mean, the Eliot's Bible is available as a download, but the other book is the Natick Dictionary by James Trumbull was probably the best resource for the indigenous language that's out there. The Middlebury College my alma mater offers a course in Abenaki, which is an Algonquin language. Again, there's a similarity of the languages. A lot of them, some of them have been reconstructed as best possible using the Native Dictionary, but I believe the Middlebury College class offers a virtual class that you can attend. So that's in Abenaki, because the natives in that area of Vermont were the Abenaki tribe. But it's it's an Algonquin. They're an Algonquin linguistic group. So if you were to learn Abenaki, you'd have a good feel for any of the Algonquin languages, which stretched out as far as you are. So the Algonquins weren't just in the East Coast. There was a pretty large swath of the country that we know today that were Algonquin linguistic people.
Yeah, and there are in fact some of the studies of John Eliot in his own handwriting, where he is trying to teach himself the Algonquin language and how it's constructed and how it's put together, which is very interesting because you can actually see his handwriting and how he's writing it out phonetically, and there are similar studies by others too, but you can really see someone trying to understand how the language and what the structure and the syntax of the language are, and how words are constructed.
Oh, okay. Because I work with Iroquoian languages. I'm not as familiar with Algonquin languages, but I'm just really interested in native languages.
Yeah.
Are there any Athabascan speakers in that part, or is it mostly Algonquin?
What was the question?
Is there any Athabascan speakers around that area, or is it all mostly Algonquin?
Mostly Algonquin, yeah. I think then, if you could audit, or if you could take virtually the Abenaki class at Middlebury, it's it's probably the most thorough in terms of really giving you an understanding. I mean, the goal of any language class at Middlebury is that when you're finished with, I think, 1 or 2 years, you're pretty good at speaking the language. So the professors have teamed with the Algonquin leaders because they have the most complete language and have created a course around the language. So that to me would be one of the recommendations if you wanted to get a real good feel for a Algonquin linguistic language. And of course, you can get the Natick Dictionary. It gives you the words in English. I mean, it's basically a dictionary. So, but if you had that with the class, Natick, I don't know if you know where Natick is. Natick, Massachusetts is a very, very, very famous place around here because of the praying Indians, and there's still a large group of them there, but that was the language that Eliot translated the Bible to. So it was actually Natick. So for example, my tribe is the Nemasket. It wasn't in Nemasket, it was the Natick dialect. So.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So fine. Again, we'll be sending out the survey. Please fill it out. Please scribble any ideas you have. We take all of this very, very seriously. The idea of I've been writing the walking tours for a couple of years now. To add and significantly build one around the Native American presence in Boston and the environments would be a fine idea. Naomi, I grew up in Waltham too, and the Historical Society has a small collection of Native American points and other material that's been found in Waltham. So maybe we can get that out and find out what other historical societies have collections of Native American pieces that were found on the ground. Maybe they talk about where, and the whole issue of how memory adheres and yours to physical objects is of course what the Memory Lands book is all about. And you just feel it. It causes you to shiver when you see some of these things. You say, this is something made by a real person a long time ago. It was important to them. It may have found a piece of meat from them that helped them survive. It's a beautiful artifact. You can see how it's structured. You can see how the design has changed over 100 years or 200 years or 500 years. It tells its own story. So yes, we'll see what we can do about that.
Also, just the giant kinesthetic motion of walking through someplace and hearing about history.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this stuff here. We just got to uncover it. And
we both probably grew up climbing Prospect Hill.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hills here and a lot of things. Yeah. I think it would be a great idea. I really look forward to it. And any advice you want on making cohesive walking tours? I mean, I know you do them too, but I'm on board, and I'd be happy to volunteer with any of those particulars in engineering. Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing. Please in there in the surveys indicate whether you'd like some more formal or informal arrangements with the partnership and like to be. We have a whole host of people who are helpers, and welcome the helperness that's out there.
Yeah. Great. I'd be pleased. Thanks, John. Yeah.
My apologies. Could I ask one more semi-personal question of Lance?
You got the mic.
Lance, I recently learned about a site, I think it's in Warren, Rhode Island. I've not been there yet, but there's in a little park with a baseball field, but on a mound, there is a large boulder engraved with, like John, I can't pronounce or can't remember how to pronounce the actual name of your ancestor who was Massasoit. But is it your belief as his ancestor that, I mean, they believe that it's his remains, or it's engraved to suggest that it's perhaps his remains that are buried there. Is that your belief? Do you share that belief?
No, I don't, because we know that what we know is that the final remains of Massasoit are buried, and I think Wayne or Roxanne might be on to confirm this with me, on Burrs Hill. I'm
sorry, that's what I meant. That's the location in Rhode Island, Burrs Hill.
Oh yeah, yes, yeah.
That is, so
there was a formal, I think a few years ago, they repatriated. The Pequot Museum had several artifacts that belonged to Massasoit, which were repatriated to that site, and so that I'm assuming that those remains were authenticated as his, but that is the belief that yes, those are his remains. Roxanne or Wayne, are you on?
I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's a lot of controversy about that. There were several artifacts that were housed in the Mashantucket Pequot Museum for several years, which our grandmother, Princess Swiftwind Bernice Young, passed away not that long ago, but she had signed for the artifacts to be held there through the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. And unfortunately, that stuff was removed not that long ago and taken supposedly to that site. We were invited to a ceremony the day after things were supposed to have been buried there. So to confirm whether or not his remains are there, our family does not believe so.
So to answer your question, it's a controversial issue, and it will be that way for a number of years.
Right, because the federally recognized tribe at that point had the ability to take things and not discuss the matters with us. So we don't believe that the knife and the bones and other things are actually physically buried there. We can't confirm that.
The issue with that is that Brown University had recognized and acknowledged our grandmother as a direct living descendant, because she was of Osamican, and that anything that had to do with the artifacts or the remains needed to be cleared by the Walmsley family, which is the family's last name, before anything could be done to them. And so there's a controversy over the whole thing. So that's where the story is. I mean, we specifically requested that the remains and the artifacts be housed in the Pequot Museum until such time we could figure out what else to do with those remains, because of the fact that we felt they had the best ability to house them, and the remains were removed without our permission, but they were removed from a federally recognized tribe, which is always an issue, you know, in terms of federally recognized tribes have the right to do certain things, or so I understand. But there was an order that the remains not be removed without permission of our family, and that's not what happened. So there's an ongoing controversy over whether or not they actually were put there, and there's obviously an ongoing controversy of the legality of removing those remains.
Right.
Thank you, and my apologies if that was at all painful for you to answer. Thank you.
No, it wasn't painful. I mean, you know, not at all. Wasn't painful at all. I mean, you know, that's I think that, you know, it was a great question, because, you know, obviously people say, oh, you know, Massasoit is Osamican is here, because that's the going narrative, right? But that's not necessarily the truth. So,
right.
Yeah. I think if there are no other questions or comments, I'm really happy that you all joined us. For the rest of you who are still here for way over time, but certainly is worth that, and it's worth the conversation and having this kind of dialogue and discourse is something that I'm hoping that as time goes on, the partnership and others will want to do. We're encouraged by it, and we're encouraged by so many of you who called in and who dialed in for this this event. So thank you all. Have a good night. Stay safe, and I hope to see you again soon at another session.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you
night.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry you had to deal with that, bro.
Yeah.
Thanks, James. Don, I'm gonna take off here.
Yep.